Welcome to our second August webinar with C4CS on crisis communication and effective employee communication in the time of COVID-19. It is our pleasure to have Oliver S. Schmidt here with us today. He has been the managing partner and president and CEO of C4CS, an international management consultancy headquartered in Pittsburgh for over 2 decades. He has more than 25 years of consulting, training, and executive coaching experience in the areas of strategic communication, crisis management, and organizational leadership. He's a multilingual executive who has lived and worked in North America, Europe, and Asia. Oliver routinely advises senior leaders, including the CEOs and members of the board of directors of publicly listed and privately held corporations regarding high-stakes business issues. On the consulting side, his focus is on working with domestic and international client partners in the areas of issues and stakeholder management, reputation and crisis management, and crisis and risk communication. He has addressed professional audiences in several dozen countries. The author of numerous peer-reviewed articles about a range of crisis management, strategic communication, and leadership topics, Oliver has conducted interviews with various domestic and international industry and mainstream media and has taught as a guest professor at leading universities in multiple countries. We welcome you today, Oliver, and just a couple of logistics questions. This webinar is being recorded, and you will be able to view this webinar again probably Wednesday from our webinar page of our website. And if you have questions, please use the questions button, and we will probably hold questions until the end of the webinar. So without any further ado, welcome, Oliver.
Thank you very much, Linda. I hope the audio is working as designed. I'm very pleased to address, I'm not exactly sure how many we have right now, but hopefully a large number of people as part of this ICOR-hosted webinar. Pleased to talk about employee communication in the time of COVID-19. From my end, webinar timing, as you just said, Linda, thank you for that. I would love to entertain questions toward the end of the webinar today. Probably going to be talking for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes or so, and then we will segue into audience questions. And without further ado, let me move to the agenda slide. We will cover the following areas today. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about fundamentals. This relates to communication, generally speaking, and then the pandemic. Walk you through a few things. We will then talk about pandemic impact assessment, an area I wanted to highlight for today. Obviously, when we're talking about COVID-19, it's important to understand how does it impact our organizations from a business end, but certainly also as far as the communication side is concerned, and that's what I would like to highlight in that section. I want to talk about message development with everyone, obviously primarily focusing on messages that will be geared toward the workforce, employees, and then give you a few tips, dive a little deeper into employee communication, which is the focus of the webinar today. And then toward the end, summary, reminder, if you will, just talk about a few things that I hope you will take away from this session and that you may want to take back to your offices and teams and discuss what you may want to do as you move forward, specifically as it relates to internal communication or employee communication. And then, as already stated, we'll have a Q&A. And I look forward to answering questions from members of the audience. First off, under fundamentals, COVID-19 response. I do a lot of crisis management related consulting and executive coaching with senior leaders. One of the things that I focus on is that we're really looking at 3 areas that in any response to an adversarial event, incident, crisis, whatever you want to call it, will inevitably entail these 3 areas that have to work seamlessly hand in hand. By managerial response in the upper left, I mean decision making. And that is usually focused upon senior management decision making. Obviously, it triggers down. If you look at the organizational hierarchy, you will want to have leaders in a good position to make decisions and follow through on them. Only then will you be able to mount what I typically refer to as the operational response, which would mean actually fixing a problem, whether that's brakes that are not working on a car, or it is an accidental release of hazardous material. It could be sexual harassment, whatever. You need to fix what is actually not working. And what ties these two elements together and really enables you as an organization to go through what I call effective crisis response, crisis management, would then be communication response. And all this applies very well to the pandemic scenario that we are looking at across the globe with COVID-19 these days. And I'm referring to it as COVID-19, even though that's essentially only the symptomology, but let's just use that term for today's purpose. Highlighted under communication response, you see the three areas that we need to keep in mind. And we will focus heavily today on the internal response, internal messaging. Again, obviously, we're talking about employees, your workforce. And what does the communication response typically entail? That's one of the questions I regularly get interfacing with boards of directors, with CEOs of companies, including very large companies that have a global footprint. First of all, we obviously need to understand what the pandemic impact is all about. And from a communication point of view, which is an outflow of the impact on the business, we need to then focus on, in addition to business objectives, on specific communication objectives. And obviously, as we're discussing employee communication, we will need to look into what are employee information needs. And that's not all we're doing from a communication perspective. We obviously need to have every single stakeholder group in mind. But since this is a webinar that focuses on employees, I have put this in italics, and we're gonna talk more about how specifically employees can be reached and should be reached and what needs to be done in that regard. And then you have, if you follow chronologically in terms of the communication response to crises or pandemic or COVID-19, you have message development. And again, you have messages that are geared toward external audiences, and that may be anything from the general public to regulators, law enforcement, media, you name it. And then internal, again in italics, and that is primarily employees. Sometimes you might want to throw in family members of employees or members of the board or retirees maybe, but let's just keep our eye on employees for the purpose of this webinar. Obviously, you do need to then look into communication channels, tools, and venues. That needs to be customized during the pandemic, and we will talk about this more in a few minutes. And once you have your messages neatly lined up in terms of matching them up with a particular channel, tool, venue, you will want to go through message testing, very importantly, often forgotten, and then message delivery, which is putting things into action. You will actually use the different channels, tools that you have lined up, that you have prepared for in terms of getting the messages out the door. And that is summarized here with the term message delivery. And the broader moniker there would be messaging. And once you have gone through this process, which ends with message delivery, you will obviously have to evaluate. Now, in a crisis situation, you do not only evaluate once you're done communicating on the whole, you actually evaluate as you go. And since you will be churning out messages at a higher frequency, it will be very much customized based on the employee's needs at the given moment in time. You will evaluate as you go, but also toward the end. And there is another slide that will talk about this specifically a little bit later. Once we have evaluated, we certainly need to see to it that we adapt in order to get better. and that typically means we need to change. In that case, we need to change our approach. We might need to change a tool. We need to change up messaging in order to be successful when it comes to communicating with internal audiences, employees, but then again, also external, even though here we will focus on the internal end and employees. Crisis communication, it's actually at the very top of each of the slides because that's at the end of the day what we're talking about here. It's communicating with employees in times of crisis, and in that case, during a prolonged pandemic. What are keys of crisis communication when you are tasked with communicating during a pandemic, other crisis event? You want to keep in mind the 4 items that are listed here. Your communication needs to be, number 1, timely. It needs to be truthful, consistent, and coordinated. And we're going to talk about these things as we go through the slides. As I walk you through the slides, I don't even want to dive into it more in regards to this slide, but we can certainly also, toward the end of today's webinar, via the questions that you might want to ask, shed a little more light on certain aspects here. The COVID-19 response from a communication point of view, or crisis communication point of view, if you want to use that term, would then entail the following. There should be a pandemic communication plan slash strategy in place. By the way, I was on the phone earlier today discussing this with the management team. It's not too late to formulate a strategy, hammer out a plan at this time, even though we're months into this thing. If you haven't had a concerted approach up until now, don't be afraid to finally get on with it and put your minds together and develop a strategy and a plan. It's not too late. That's the core message here. The focus needs to be on, since we're discussing internal communication, obviously on employees, but do not forget about other stakeholders as you are working on such a plan. Unless it's limited to internal communication only, your plan, you certainly do want to include external audience, most notably customers or clients, depending on whether you are a business that sells products or services. And then it's very important, I can't stress it enough, for those who are in leadership roles, whether that's middle management, whether that's upper management, company leadership, leading decisively with empathy and compassion is really what it boils down to in this time of COVID-19. And I've had numerous discussions, even just over the last couple of weeks, with different leadership teams that have trouble in a way as they are assessing the impact of the pandemic and trying to figure out how to respond. They have trouble to really embrace empathy and compassion as concepts that play a critical role in this time of crisis, in this time of COVID-19. We do need to have clear and easy to understand messages going out. If you have a conversation with your folks on the shop floor, then you obviously have to have messaging going out that can be understood by this particular audience, by those stakeholders. And that can sometimes be challenging. I work a lot with attorneys, medical doctors, engineers, and not utilizing to the degree that professionals are used to, for instance, acronyms, language that people understand who are at the same educational level, the same level of training within whatever discipline, but toning it down and making it, let's say, 6th grade level so that anybody out there on the street can understand it, can certainly be difficult. And we want to have these clear messages in regards to, for instance, health and safety, most notably, when we talk about productivity with employees, when we talk about assistance that is being provided to employees across the board, we do need to have clear and easy to understand messages. It is also important to talk to employees first. By that, I mean if you have, for instance, negative news regarding workforce reduction, and many companies across the globe, obviously these days, do have to let go of a certain percentage of the workforce, this is information that should reach employees before they hear about it through, for instance, the media. Because not only will such a scenario, if they hear it about it first through the media or another source, will not only demotivate people who are about to leave the company as a result of the workforce reduction, but it will also have a negative impact on those employees that will remain with the company. They might ask, well, am I just a number and I'm going to be next? So this needs to be done the right way. There is a one voice policy hopefully in place. I'm not going to go into that a whole lot more today, but it basically means that we need to sing from the same song sheet as communicators. And this is all geared toward eradicating uncertainty. It's important for employees to understand that they're an integral part of the effort to overcome this crisis, to overcome the pandemic. And as such, it needs to be communicated what particular important role they play in all this. Therefore, the communication needs to be customized, and it needs to be two-way. By that, we mean it needs to have feedback options available. So it's not just a one-way street telling employees what to do, but it's actually very carefully listening to employees and inviting them to provide feedback and to really say what's on their mind, to talk about their challenges, whether it's daycare related, whether it's protective equipment related, whatever may be on their minds, and frankly distract them from doing their job, that has to be addressed via the communication within the company, and feedback options are critical. Customization of content in terms of channel, in terms of increased frequency and volume of communication, specifically geared toward managing problems that employees have, including as far as their private lives are concerned, so they are in a better position to do the things that will help the organization overcome the crisis. That's key. And obviously here again, evaluation plays a critical role. Even if you have set up feedback functions, you do need to understand if things are working. So if you have a suggestion box, if you have a regular meeting online with a certain portion of the workforce, and they have an opportunity to ask questions, you may have leaders appear on video or in person, town hall, other options. Please do keep in mind that evaluation remains critical and should obviously be well thought through. As far as the pandemic impact assessment is concerned, I believe I only have 3 slides here for you. The first one I'm pulling up right now talks about pandemic impact assessment. And that's a very important slide that I like to highlight. Usually when my colleagues and I work with management teams, no matter the industry, size of company is probably almost irrelevant as well. Usually larger companies, but also smaller companies and management teams will have the following problem. Their view when it comes to a crisis, including the pandemic we're going through right now, will be, at least as a tendency, technical or analytic. What does that mean? They will want to focus on magnitude, probability. They will discuss understood consequences of known facts. And therefore, liability is, in the US at least, one of the things that is on everyone's mind. But there is a problem. There's a big problem with this approach because it leaves out what we refer to as, let's just say, emotions. How about emotions? How about employees under duress? How about employees not sure whether they will be let go, not sure how this is going to impact their family, their financial stability? And management, therefore, needs to embrace what we typically refer to at C4CS as the public view, or in that case, employee view. Across the board, all hierarchical levels, all locations, management must understand, and this is where empathy comes in, where compassion comes in, must understand that the employee view is, in many cases, not one that can be described as technical, or at least not purely technical or analytic. It will be effective or emotional. And that means it is shaped by employee perception. It is shaped by how employees see themselves within the company, but also as far as pressure, as far as complications caused by the virus and related factors in their daily lives is concerned. And influenced by stakeholder outreach means that employees can certainly become upset. They can certainly reach a certain point in terms of the pressure, the stress that they deal with, where they may formulate things in a way amongst themselves that amounts to water cooler talk, or whatever you want to call it, where rumors start flying, where people get demotivated, where people might not believe in management in the way the company has charted, and that's all bad. Therefore, it's very important that employees need to be understood in terms of their feelings, in terms of their emotions, and that is something that management teams left and right need to be counseled on during this time a lot. I've been in many different Zoom meetings, phone conversations, where it had to be highlighted that outside of, yes, the facts, the ramifications, consequences as a result of whatever facts it may be, it is critically important to understand that employees do have a view that is more emotional, and we need to, as management, go to where employees are and develop as best as possible an understanding of how they can be supported and assisted at work as well as at the home office and as far as their families are concerned, because only then will the organization be able to overcome the crisis, the pandemic. Otherwise, we're not going to hear it's not fair. Senior management doesn't understand me. They don't have any feelings. You name it. You could add to this list as you like, but there's probably a lot that employees will say if they're not understood. They may no longer trust management, and they may no longer want to work hard in order to reach business goals. So, therefore, it is important to focus a lot on message development. What are we going to say to employees, to certain members within the employee base or groups of employees, and in order to identify what information needs are during a crisis, generally speaking, C4CS uses this list of 8 questions that's more geared towards crises, generally speaking, not necessarily a pandemic, but the questions certainly apply to the pandemic scenario. And it's important to keep in mind that we need to go through what happened, when did it happen, where did it happen, and so forth. And not just as far as the umbrella level is concerned in terms of the pandemic, but all of the resulting crises or the resulting problems for each and every employee, ideally. And at the end of the day, it's really how do we feel about it, and what are we doing about it? And that's where it comes down to helping employees, as stated earlier, finding ways in which employees at work, as they're performing their duties, can be supported in order to be as effective as possible. And these days, that translates heavily into the home front. What if employees are constantly worried about daycare and the lack thereof? Well, that means they will not be able to, in all likelihood, focus as much on their work for whatever organization they are working, and therefore their performance will lack. And that's where we need to be very careful and certainly also think about creative and new ways to communicate with employees. And that is always organization specific. When I say creative, new ways, there is no organization identical in terms of its needs, and it could even be the closest competitor in a particular space. The communication tools, needs, how it's going to be rolled out will at the end of the day differ. Even if it's just minute difference, there will be differences for sure. So customized employee communication, as depicted on this slide, is all about, from left to right, what do they think and do now, your employees? What do they care about? And what do you, as the organization, as the management team, as the communications personnel, what do you want them to think or do in terms of how you are addressing their problems? What informational needs exist in terms of daycare options, for instance? Have you previously communicated transparently that there are supports available to employees? Well, has that worked? Has your evaluation revealed that this was a message that rang true with the audience? And if not, what then needs to be done in order to make that happen? And these questions will result, and this is again something that we use for any crisis, will result in your messages and the development of those messages, which need to adhere to the following requirements. Messages one must be true. This is about honesty. If the message is not true, then it will be identifiable as such, and the audience may very well tune out because it is untruthful what you're saying. Now, if there's a change in terms of facts that were previously not available to you, and it turns out that what you said earlier was not true, then now would be a good time to address the changes and very frankly talk about the fact that as a result of new facts now being available, you would like to correct the record. And that is something that certainly can and should in fact be done with employees. Messages must sound true to the speaker. So if you have spokespersons speaking on behalf of the company, usually that would in all likelihood at least be senior management or direct supervisors, whatever your setup there may be. And that's certainly something that also needs to be assessed on a company specific basis, and decisions need to be based upon what are you going to communicate and how can the folks best be reached. This will be briefly discussed in a slide that's coming up. But trust me, if the spokesperson is not credible, if the audience believes that the spokesperson himself or herself does not buy into the message that she or he has just conveyed, then that's not good. The message will then therefore not have the desired effect. And lastly, messages must sound true to the audience. If for whatever reason, even though it is true, what is being said, if it is correct information, if for whatever reason the audience believes it to not be believable, then the messaging will be unsuccessful also. In regards to key messages, and that's a term that we often use, and that carries over into crisis management related situations, then we might use the term crisis communication. We have to keep in mind the following three areas. Key messages are all about preparing to say what you know, that would be facts. Preparing to say how you feel about it, that would be feelings, empathy. And then preparing to say what you will do about it, that's the actions. And this is also included on the right via the graphic, our message triangle. If you fail to, in your communication to employees or any other stakeholder group, as you're going through the pandemic, organizationally speaking, if you fail to properly address facts or feelings or actions, then you will most likely not succeed in terms of your communication. So it's very important to keep all three areas in mind. And then we're coming up on employees and specific tips, for lack of a better word, in regards to communicating with employees in times of crisis, and very specifically during this pandemic. First off, what not to do. It's a cartoon I have used in the past. Okay, people, the question is, should we deny first and then delay, or delay first and then deny? And while you might think that this is certainly something from yesteryear, we still, in 2020, fairly regularly, unfortunately, run into situations, not verbatim, obviously, where senior management is not upfront, is unfortunately not forthcoming, and therefore discussions such as what is depicted here may be happening in boardrooms, in executive team meetings. And I'm not saying that this is a widespread phenomenon. I'm just saying that as a tendency, one can certainly say that it has not been completely eradicated. We still see it. Our motto is to be forthcoming, upfront. Having skeletons in the closet is usually not at all a good idea. And certainly there is the liability piece that needs to be discussed, but we find that nowadays even attorneys, whether they're in-house or external counsel, understand very well that in addition to the court of law, there is a court of public opinion. And in order to prevail in both, there has to be a middle ground. So in order to shield yourself from liability, not to say anything may oftentimes not be at all the best idea, because what it may very well create is reputation loss, and as a result of that, actual financial loss where the bottom line gets a hit. So this is something that we address with senior management teams, and certainly coach senior leaders or managers in general in regard to the necessity to be open, forthcoming, and address the pandemic as well as other crises in a way so that information is shared freely to the degree that the law allows, whether you're running into HIPAA-related limitations and so forth. Obviously, you need to adhere to that. But otherwise, it's definitely a good idea at least to have discussions as a management team. Listen very carefully to counsel, but also listen very carefully to those that understand crisis management, crisis communication, and disciplines where a slightly different viewpoint may exist. As far as employees go, obviously, it is critical to understand that without informed, dedicated, and trusting employees, the pandemic response is likely going to fail, at least in some shape or form. Certain areas, you might still survive as an organization and do reasonably well in different areas. However, I can pretty much guarantee you, even though it's a little hard to back it up in terms of actual numbers and research, that if you do not have an informed workforce, a dedicated workforce, employees that trust the company management, then most likely your performance as an organization will suffer. That said, how can the organization, how can companies help employees and their loved ones in this time of crisis, during this pandemic? That's really the key question, a question that needs to be discussed ideally on a daily basis. I talked about employee feedback earlier. This is where it comes in. Listen very, very carefully. That's the next bullet here, as a leader. And I'm talking about shift supervisors as well as the CEO of a Fortune 100 company. Listening is really key. C4CS did in the early days of the pandemic, from a U.S. standpoint at least, in mid-April, we conducted a survey and received answers from leaders across the globe. Overwhelmingly, they did fortunately say that communication was key in order to overcoming the challenges posed by the pandemic, and that listening was particularly important during this time. And again, I do want to highlight that listening is key. And in addition to that, as it says here, explaining hard decisions, and you have to put everything into context. So if you do need to let go of a portion of the workforce, go about this in a professional manner. Keep in mind that there are employees that will remain with the company, and those need to be communicated with as well as you are letting go others in order for them to keep trusting senior management and wanting to stay with the organization in a committed, dedicated way. That is very important. Leaders need to be visible. I've said earlier briefly, whether it's via video, obviously in person, if at all possible. That's very, very important. One leader recently said to me, well, Oliver, is it even possible for our organization, international in terms of footprint, to be looking at a situation where I could potentially over communicate during this pandemic? And the answer was probably not. If what you are doing is not becoming too repetitive, or the approach is not in line with what the audience needs, over communicating is probably not something that is very likely to happen. Stay focused with the communication, choose wisely in terms of what you're saying, how you're saying it, where you're saying it, and so forth. But repetition is good up to a certain point for sure. And then lastly, as per the slide, understanding that all employees across industries, not just with your company, with other companies, other organizations, are certainly currently experiencing stress is very important. So while your employee, he or she, is doing the job probably out of a home office right now, in many cases, there is a spouse, there are children, there are other relatives, friends, and those may be experiencing stress, even if your employee, let's say, works for a tech company and has been working out of the home office for years anyhow. Still, due to social connections, we're all experiencing stress right now, and that needs to be factored into senior management decision making for sure. How does all this affect employees? Well, crises in general affect employees, and it's no different with the pandemic. There's uncertainty, there's pressure, there's anxiety, there's stress, and it could be, as already stated, in regards to health concerns, job concerns, and so forth. And that needs to be front and center when senior management discusses and gets counseled in regards to communication with employees. Specifically regarding COVID-19 and employees, Gallup, I believe that was back in April, came out with the first research results regarding COVID-19 and how employees are affected and what would be good in order to appropriately address employee concerns. And it was revealed that stability, hope, compassion, and trust were really the four pillars of what needed to be addressed in terms of employee communication geared toward making life easier for employees, enabling them to continue to be motivated and dedicated. The messages that are then being conveyed by management or by the company on the internal end of things, so going to employees, must inform, must educate, and motivate. It needs to be transparent what's going on. The problems, as stated earlier, that employees have need to be communicated via two-way communication and feedback options. And education is very critical, is absolutely important right now, because only those that are fully informed and educated in terms of, for instance, alternative options, assistance available to them and their families. I mentioned daycare a few times. That's a critical issue, one of many. And motivating employees, showing compassion, showing that we're all in this together, that's definitely good. What employees want, what they need to know, and what they ultimately need to continue to buy into without fail is the clear way forward. And if a management team have been working a lot with senior leaders on identifying this clear way forward from a crisis management point of view, and then communicating it is really critical. As C4CS does both crisis management, going into BCP, DR, and all the different areas, but also strategic communication. We've been in a good position since the start of the pandemic to help bring these areas together and not only develop that clear way forward to whatever degree we're asked to be involved in it, but then also to provide the necessary support in order to actually communicate what that clear way forward is, and communicate it in a way so that everyone within the organization ideally understands fully what we're trying to accomplish, what the objectives are, what the end goal is, and have multiple follow-ups in regards to every single objective as we're on the way to achieving it. Feeling empowered to show resilience is something that employees like a lot, that they embrace. And the practical support that I mentioned earlier can be in the form of unpaid leave. I mentioned personal protective equipment, remote work, lots and lots of different areas in which help can be made available. Seeing the company vision, mission, values, and action, that's really what it boils down to. And that's how companies will prevail. What do you need to ask before you communicate with employees? And it's just focusing on employees, but will apply to other stakeholders as well. What is the desired result of the communication? That would be your objective. What will be communicated? That's the message. We've been talking about message development and delivery. Who will initiate the crisis communication? The communication during the pandemic, that would be the sender. Is it going to be the CEO appearing on video or in front of people doing a series of town hall meetings? Lots of different options available that need to be picked carefully. It needs to be customized in terms of the strategic approach and tactical approach. Also, which groups of employees and managers will be communicated with? Be very specific there, targeted. While the message on the foundational level will not change, certainly wording can and should change. Again, we want to be understood. We want to have messages that resonate with the particular audience. And obviously, ultimately, we have to formulate things differently when we're talking to shop floor workers as opposed to those who report directly to senior leadership of the company. So that needs to be kept in mind. How and where will the crisis communication happen? Channel, value, tool. When will it happen? The timeline. And then asking before communicating with employees as part of the evaluation process and ongoing pandemic response planning, was the crisis communication objective met? And how can we do better? And that's the evaluation piece and optimization piece that we definitely need to go through in terms of the communication as well. I'm nearing the end here of my portion of the actual presentation. Before we go into the Q&A, I wanted to provide the opportunity to maybe revisit with me just a couple of things that we have on the following slide. First of all, it is important to have a communication readiness assessment. It's clear that we do need to understand what the impacts are of the pandemic, and from a business point of view, nearly every company that I've spoken with has done a pretty good job in terms of developing an understanding of what the impacts are, and then also obviously going into, well, what needs to be done in order to rectify the situation, in order to get better. I mentioned creative and new as terminology earlier, pivoting, maybe changing the business model. All these things are, from a business perspective, important. And that's where C4CS provides assistance. We are the crisis management arm of our business in terms of working with crisis response teams, crisis management teams, where we put together training exercises and so forth. But there's also the communication piece, and readiness assessment specifically regarding communication is important. In fact, it is increasingly important as a result of all of the different characteristics that the pandemic has in terms of the need for communication and the need for effective communication. As a result of that, it is important to have what was referred to earlier as a pandemic communication plan. Lots of organizations have a crisis communication plan. If that can be adapted to this particular pandemic-related scenario, that's fine. If not, and in a lot of cases we found it could not, then something needs to be hammered out that's specifically discussing and addressing communication needs, external and internal communication in regards to the pandemic. And where employees come in again, internal communication, that should actually, if at all possible, be written down in terms of the tactics that will be deployed, in terms of obviously the messages that needs to be developed, stakeholder specific. And once we are only focusing on employees, it needs to be broken down to certain groups of employees that could be specific to the location where they're in, specific to the hierarchical level, specific to the functional area in which they work for the organization. There are many different ways to divvy things up. And the more comprehensive we can be in terms of targeting very specific employee groups, the better, for sure. Adjusting channel, content, frequency, volume, already talked about it. Everything should be customized. And in the past, we've had conversations with clients where we spent hours on developing messages, where we spent a long time on customizing the actual communication in terms of the channel. We discussed frequently increasing volume. How can we make the content resonate even better with those in the audience, those groups of employees? And certainly, generally speaking, an uptick in terms of frequency is a very good idea during this pandemic. And I'm sure many organizations represented among the attendees of this webinar have already gone in that direction. It's a very good idea to continue looking at where can you tweak things in order to get even better in terms of the message development, message delivery piece as it concerns channel, content, frequency, volume, and so forth. Again, two-way communication and listening are absolutely key. Those who do not listen are making a terrible mistake. I actually recently published an article during the pandemic in regards to, this was published in the Risk and Resilience Hub article on 10 tips regarding employee communication, and a lot was already addressed today during this webinar. If there's interest, I'll be happy to email to those of you who would like to read the article a link separately. But what it all boils down to is that really the messaging has to be effective. It has to work. So effective development and delivery of messages is absolutely key. And we want to evaluate as we're going through this process and evaluating as we're getting closer to what we have identified in terms of the end result. By the way, 24/7 internet and media monitoring does play a role here too, because that's with many companies that we work with a great tool for gaining and collecting intelligence. We've seen that work with companies across different industries as senior management is being informed of what's going on out there, how are competitors reacting to the pandemic, what can we maybe learn from them, what can we learn from authorities, whether that's in the health and safety arena, epidemiologists, and so forth. So that's a tool that I wanted to specifically mention here. I'm certainly happy to, at this point, answer any questions that webinar participants may have. I haven't seen anything listed here in the questions tab. Certainly opening it up now. If you would like to ask questions, please feel free to do so. I frequently do receive questions, so I can easily tap into what I have received from lots of different, not just clients, but contacts across sectors where internal communication in particular is not working so well, and maybe talk about this a little bit more.
Sure. So Oliver, we do have one question that came in.
Okay.
How would you address refusal to return to the workplace? And this was actually one of my questions as well. I have 4 kids in the workforce, and one of them is being asked to travel and do all sorts of things that she's not comfortable with. So while she's working, she doesn't want to do everything. So how would you address that? And how, like during a pandemic, what are some options that might be different?
Yeah, we actually Yeah, we fairly recently had let's say comparable question posed by a manufacturing client. There's also travel involved, travel in particular to states where infection numbers may be more disconcerting than in others. So if somebody needs to travel to, let's just say, California, Arizona, Texas, whatever it may be, and within the state to a specific area where there may be a greater risk of an infection resulting from exposure, then that is something, number one, that I would definitely recommend be addressed head on by management and be woven into the communication with employees. Nothing can be more detrimental to employees no longer being motivated, potentially thinking about leaving the company, just no longer trusting senior management, than not wanting to listen to employees and basically, from a senior management's point of view, ignoring those concerns. We have unfortunately seen it. The companies that were recently counseled in regards to these issues sometimes were a little reluctant, initially at least, to address these concerns, or even before addressing, looking into whether those concerns are even there. And there are lots of ways in which that can be done. We've helped with internal surveys in order to develop a better understanding whether there are such concerns. And they're certainly not only related to travel. I mean, we've assisted companies with how to basically redesign workspaces, whether it's the shop floor or an office space that used to be an open office space. Now there's lots of plexiglass in it. There's signage. There are certain flow of traffic within the offices. So we've helped with all of these different things. But from a communication point of view, again, it's first of all critical that management understand that these concerns exist. Maybe not a large number of employees has ever voiced them, but it's important to understand what's going on. And by inviting employees to speak freely without any negative repercussions, senior management is setting themselves up to make good decisions down the road, because again, nothing could be more negative for the organization as a whole than to lose qualified and dedicated employees down the road. For instance, Linda, you said one of your kids is being asked to travel. Well, what if your kid or anybody else decided at a certain point, no, this is just too risky for me, and I'm just gonna call in sick. I'm just not gonna go on the trip, and even though I'm actually not feeling that right now, there is too much at stake for me. It may also be an employee. We've had those situations too, where there is an immunological problem, could be a diabetic, or you name it. And for whatever reason, even after months of now going through the pandemic, the company still has not identified employees with specific health problems and is now asking someone who has either that individual himself or herself, or a family member, a very close family member, has a medical condition which should actually preclude that in particular individual from any travel whatsoever, almost certainly air travel or travel to areas where there is a higher number of infections prevalent. And those are things that management needs to assess and needs to adequately respond to. And again, it's about showing empathy. We could name any number of examples. To stick with what I just said, travel-related restrictions, when they're no longer in place, cannot translate into now employees having to travel to certain areas no matter what. You need to, as a management team, as a company, be in tune with what employees think about these things. You need to understand who within the workforce has certain limitations as a result of, for instance, having a family member who is a diabetic, could be a child, diabetes 1 within the family. Well, that's a no-no. And I'm not just talking liability, which is certainly something that enters the equation here as well, but from a motivational point of view, from the point of view of keeping the workforce engaged and having everyone work toward that common goal of getting through the pandemic as best as possible, It's a very, very good idea to be in tune with what the employees think, what they have in terms of problems, how they can be helped. Again, empathy, compassion, those are keys here.
That is actually something I find that is really, really helpful, because it's going to make a long-term difference in your organization, where somebody might not quit now, but they might quit later if they haven't felt like they've been supported. And this whole idea of building a culture where people want to work there and give their best is really going to come down to when it's how you treat people when you're in the middle of a crisis that's going to impact that.
Exactly. And
which kind of leads to our next question,
mm-hmm.
which is, so if someone's trying to do like a people resilience assessment, or really try to figure out like how much capacity people have for stress and change and all that kind of thing, is there any sort of tool or software that you would recommend?
Yeah, we've actually been working with a couple of partner companies that have developed apps in that regard. I'll be happy to share this information. The last slide in this deck, going to words of wisdom here, and I'm certainly making the deck available to anybody who would like to have it. I will be glad to respond to email requests. Here's the contact information for me, and then share with those participating in the webinar today, or others who come across this information at a later time. We'll be more than happy to share information regarding those apps. The apps can be utilized, for instance, in regards to status quo as far as health is concerned, but it also can be customized to have surveys delivered to any number of employees. Then there are certainly other ways to conduct surveys. I mentioned town halls earlier. I meant video messages with a feedback option built into it. Good idea for companies. Clients' contacts are utilizing this as a tool. A toll-free number for employees, or a dedicated email address for employees to submit questions. And it's not just about making these tools available, but actually encouraging employees to utilize them. So there needs to be information going out to the employees that says, we want your input. We are asking you, please provide us input. And we're absolutely making it clear that there aren't any repercussions, negative impacts, if indeed an employee voices concerns, if indeed an employee talks about challenges regarding home life, regarding whatever it may be. That needs to be very clear. And this comes from the top. If empathy and compassion are core values that can be lived now, that can be put into practice, ideally on a daily basis, then everyone within the senior management team, going down the management ladder, should really be involved in making it utterly clear that the feedback is, and listening to employees is of critical importance at this time. And when it actually is being provided, it is absolutely important to act upon it. I mean, if you receive the feedback but you don't do anything as far as the management team is concerned, then you might have as well not asked in the first place. So following through on that is equally important.
Well, and that kind of really leads to my next kind of question/comment, is that this is a really stressful time, and that's normally when an organization has some kind of a disaster, for example, it's usually happening just to that organization, and people can go and get support other places, and it's just one part of their lives. Well, in this case, it's happening to everybody, and it's happening to everybody everywhere.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And even if a person or family has not had any impact, really no negative impact, people are still feeling stressed because of all of the change that's happening and all of the uncertainty and the fact that their life could change in an instant. And I think this goes back again to culture and really taking care of your people and understanding that even if they've not gotten sick and not lost their jobs and not, maybe their kids are able to go to school, or maybe they like home, the home learning better anyways, whatever it is, that they're still feeling stress and anxiety. And so companies need to manage that. And one of the things that I've heard several people say is that because we're communicating about different things, and we're not in necessarily, those of us that work in an office or in a place where there's, normally we're having people around us, that we're not getting that same interaction with our peers at work, and we're not having those casual conversations and our brain, kind of the brainstorming pieces, everything's scheduled. And so understanding that we have to actually schedule meetings just to talk to people in our companies, and just not necessarily about work, just to have those kind of lunchtime conversations that you would have, or that you might have socially while you're at work.
Right.
And again, all that goes back to the culture. The culture and leadership is such a key piece of this. It's really difficult to underestimate how important it is. And so just to close, what we can do, Oliver, is after the webinar, everyone who has attended at least 35 minutes receives a certificate so they can get CEU points. And so if you're okay, can we just send your presentation along with that?
Sure, yeah. I will make a PDF available, and then that can certainly be shared with those who were on the webinar, as well as with others who might make contact later, Linda. By all means.
Okay, wonderful. And just to remind everyone, the recording will be available in the next day or two. So if you'd like to listen again or share it with someone else, you're able to do that. It'll be available on demand for the next 30 days, and then it does go into the ICOR members only area. But Oliver, thank you so much for your time today. It was very informational, and we really appreciate the fact that you were willing to talk for us.
Thanks for the opportunity, Linda, and I certainly do look forward to receiving feedback. If anybody feels like they want to follow up, by all means.
There'll be a survey that'll go out in
okay, great. That's even better.
Well. And so if everyone could participate in that, we would appreciate it. So thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time. Happy Monday, and have a good rest of the week.
Okay. Thank you for me, too. Bye now.